All right, Krystal, what's on your radar?
Well, yesterday, Joe Biden rolled out a Buy American executive order. He enjoyed some nice splashy headlines. Now, the order is meant to tighten the rules requiring the federal government to buy American-made products. But as I dug into the weeds, I was faced with what's becoming a very familiar internal tug of war. Obviously, on its face, the order's positive. It's going to encourage American jobs and manufacturing. That's all great. I also compared it to Trump's track record, where the guy who accurately pointed to the American carnage of destroyed former manufacturing towns, but then failed to take one single meaningful step to actually revitalize those towns. But on the other hand, the order felt like kind of a half measure. It tightens loopholes, but it doesn't close them. Its effects are sure to be scattered, hard to measure if it really changes anything at all. And most of all, it's a one-off move. It's divorced from any understanding of how America ended up in such bad shape or comprehensive vision for how to forge a new reality. The whole thing's kind of perfect, isn't it? Trump talks a big game and then does literally nothing. Biden makes some marginal improvements that aren't going to really change a lot and gets rapturous media coverage for it. But it did lead me to really ponder this question. How should we actually judge the Biden administration? It seems to me there are a few possible standards. The first and lowest would be, is he better than Trump? Now that seems to be the standard most of the media is holding him to, which is honestly kind of an anti-standard. When he manages to write a tweet that does not offend half the country or doesn't actively incite angry mobs and avoids advocating for Americans to inject themselves with bleach, they're delighted. They have chills. They wax poetic about his arms embracing the nation. They swoon over his ability to publicly conduct himself like an approximation of a normal human being. Needless to say, we should be expecting a bit more, since he can be better than Trump by doing literal nothing. Look, it's a natural tendency. You get in a new relationship, you can't help judging it by the old relationship, and so the new guy may get credit for just not being an abusive asshole when no one should really get any bonus points just for operating by the most basic standards of human decency. So no, Biden gets no points for just not being the worst person ever. Now the next standard would be, does Biden make some marginal improvements? We can call this the Obama standard. That's the zone where this Buy American order falls into, or getting back in the Paris climate deal, or wherever Biden's increasingly compromised stimulus plan ultimately lands. Are some improvements being made around the margins that really will better life for some? I understand the appeal of this standard, and actually I've bought into it for most of my adult life. Are there somewhat fewer kids in cages? Is climate change modestly slowed? Do working people get subsidies to help them buy into the hellscape of corporate health insurance? Liberals will, of course, insist that this bar is sufficient. Sure, they may push Team Blue to do better, but ultimately, they're going to be satisfied that there are enough line items to point to where incremental improvements were ultimately made. And you know what? There would have been more of a case for this standard, frankly, if Democrats didn't have complete control of government. You could more colorably make the case that you want to go bigger, but you just don't have the power. Now, it'd still be a stretch, given the power of the executive and the power of the bully pulpit, as we've been discussing. But one might be tempted to cut them some slack. But no, I believe we should judge Biden by the standard he himself has set. He has made a large portrait of FDR, the focal point of the Oval Office. His aides have signaled he understands the magnitude of the moment and the crises that we face. And he ran on healing the soul of the nation. Now, what does that actually mean? What will it require? Reverend Barber recently laid it out for us very clearly last week.
When I preach this morning, I'm preaching from a text, an Old Testament text that's honored by Muslims and Christians and Jews that actually lays out what to do when you've been through a crisis, narcissistic leadership, lying leadership, greedy leadership. It says that to repair the nation, you must lift from the bottom. To prepare for the nation, you must deal with unfair practices. So what we're saying, have said to them is in this moment, we need to see living wages that will help the body. We need to deal with systemic racism in all of its form, from police brutality, but also towards, we need immigrant justice. We need to deal with our native indigenous people and treating them fairly. We need expansion of health care. We need to fix the Voting Rights Act that has been held up from being fixed for over 2,600 days since 2013. We need infrastructure development in the poor, low wealth communities that will lift the whole nation. In other words, we need to lift from the bottom and end unfair practices. And if you do that, you can repair the soul because you will have dealt with the sickness in the body.
You have to lift from the bottom. The truth is, we are way beyond the point when incremental is remotely good enough because the American body is so sick. And the longer that sickness festers, the more difficult it becomes to change course, or at least to do so peacefully. Because the more people are frustrated, cooped up, and screwed over, the more cynicism and nihilism will grow. The more likely you are to have political violence normalized and to end up with another Trumpian figure, only this one might actually have some competence and ideological commitment to back up his amorality and will to power. So how do I think about the Buy American order and the other positive but small steps of the early Biden admin? Well, I guess it depends. Are they really one-offs, designed for a nice headline and appearance of progress? Or are they part of a larger vision, strategy of real healing that would put humanity back at the center of governance, devolve power to working class people, provide the basics of a decent life to all? We're going to know very soon, because right now is the moment. With his honeymoon period, high approval ratings, and Wall Street still unsure how exactly this is all going to work out, fears of pitchforks still fresh and very real. Look, I'll be happy to acknowledge the small improvements, but if there aren't big moves now, while Democrats control all and the public is hungry for action, they're not coming. Here's hoping that Joe Biden proves me all wrong. And Sagar, it really is a bit of a challenge because any of these individual things, like I look at the list of executive orders, I'm like, okay, good. And I don't want to be a hater. I want to be honest about where he deserves credit and where he's falling short. But I think when you look at the overall metric of this administration, you have to acknowledge the context that we're in, that the American people desperately need big change, and that is the standard that he has in fact set for himself. So while I'm happy to give credit on these individual metrics, he's signing new executive orders with regards to climate change, which fall very much in the same category of like, okay, well, this is like a modest improvement. I guess I give him credit for him. I think overall, you have to judge this administration a failure if they don't seize the moment to turn the ship.
Yeah, no, look, I had to deal with this with Trump, and the Trump people would always get so mad. They're like, well, you have to give him credit for like this one executive order. And I'm like, do I though? That's like baseline about what you're, like any Republican in office would be doing even moderately successful if you had done what you said you would do. And so what's happening here? Did you pass fundamental transformational legislation that cannot be undone by your successor? That's how I view actual change in America. What is the last piece of legislation that has actually, done that? And in terms of what he did, it was tax cuts. Yeah. And so that's the same thing with Biden. Yeah, I mean, if you're looking at this from a Democratic perspective, it should be the same thing. It's like, yeah, this executive order is great. They'd always be like, oh, well, see, he signed this Buy American executive order in 2017. I'm like, so? That's like not that great. Go pass a real infrastructure package, $2 trillion, and actually transform the city of Detroit, and I'll be sitting here clapping with you all day long. I'm not going to give you credit for doing the very baseline of what you did. So whenever I say Trump was a failure, that's what I'm talking about. Failure relative to the position that you could have occupied. That is how we should judge all politicians, not on, well, here are like the measly crumbs that they did that are marginally better than a Democrat. Okay, like, so what? That's not reason enough in order to cheer you on. That's just playing defense and saying, well, and it also leads to what we've talked about here. If you're only going to celebrate the crumbs that they throw you, then that's all they're ever going to give you, which is all they ever want. What they want to turn the game into is our crumbs are better than the crumbs that they throw to their base. I'm not playing. I self-exit from this. from this. I will not be satisfied with crumbs. I want a steak. Okay, like that's what I want, and they won't give it to you.
No, they will not. And even each one of these executive orders, I've really looked at them carefully because you'll see it's funny the way they're touted. So even on the Buy American order, like I really went and read through it and the coverage of it, all of that. And you see a lot of very sloppy coverage that's just like, federal government has to buy American now, period.
No, they don't.
Well, then you start to read and it's like, well, no, actually, he's just shifting the composition of the amount of the product that has to be made in America. And you ask yourself,
on a 3-year time scale.
Right, exactly. And then you ask yourself, or like with, he signed another executive order that was federal government contractors have to pay their workers $15 an hour. But again, if you look at the details, it's actually like, well, we're going to put them on a path to eventually pay $50. We're going to commission a study that figures out how to get them to $15 an hour. And you're like, why? Like, why not just say you have to pay them $15? Why not just say it has to be made in America with no exceptions. And it's because they engineer everything to try to avoid blowback from business and from their donors. And unfortunately, the Democratic Party has every manner of elites has consolidated behind the Democratic Party. So they take their viewpoints very, very seriously. When again, and we keep talking about FDR, what he understood is that it was actually great politics to have business leaders and elites and bankers and all these people furious at him, and not to mention the media. Talked to Thomas Frank recently, and he brought up the fact 85% of newspapers endorsed against FDR, and he won easily. All the mainstream economists, all the mainstream academics, all the business leaders, they all hated him. And that was precisely why the people loved him. But the Democrats and the Republicans, even more so the Republicans, they engineer everything to avoid any blowback from these elite communities. Why? Because they're dependent on them, because they are them. I mean, that's really the bottom line.
No, you're right. I mean, I was recently talking with Michael Lind, who's kind of like my intellectual North Star. He made the same point about FDR. He was like, yeah, FDR was hated by the entire elite class, by the intellectuals. The only group where he had positive popularity, and look, the data back then wasn't perfect, but here's where it was. Amongst people below 6th grade education. That was it. That was the only place where he had a net positive rating for most of his presidency. But guess what? There's a hell of a lot more of those people back than the rest. So there you go. That's how you actually win and govern in America. And he was elected 4 times as president of the United States. It's really not that hard, but apparently we've all forgotten it, and I just don't know why.
Yeah, well, it's not just forgotten, but the corruption and the way that money underpins the system ensures that it will continue to be forgotten. Next on Rising, Team Rising is going to join us to talk about a newly opened Senate seat in Ohio. This is actually really interesting and significant. That's when Rising returns.